Hey, folks, good morning. Cybersecurity resources, there aren't enough of them out there, which means you have to use them wisely. That's what we talk about today. I'm Ted Gutierrez, your host on the Business of Cyber show. We're on episode 11. The last couple of weeks and months have been amazing. We've been talking to asset owners, IT and OT leaders across the critical infrastructure sector about three major resource pools that no one seems to have enough of: the people, the time, and the budget associated with cybersecurity. That's really the mainstay of the Business of Cybersecurity show. And I am super excited to talk today about OT sites and why they're different. Now, if you take a look at the internet, if you go to any conference, if you go to any boardroom, what you're going to find is that there is, within the critical infrastructure sectors, a continual evolution, let's say, of belief systems, actions, budgets associated with what are we going to do with OT? What are we going to do with operational technology? What are we going to do with all of this different automation systems inside of our various facilities? Now, we know that for the last 30 or 40 years, these weren't really designed for security, but as threats continue to evolve on a global level at a pace that most companies are concerned about keeping up with, OT security has become a very, very big topic for companies of all sizes and all sectors. Now, coming specifically from the energy and the oil and gas sector, I've seen it happen on rigs. I've seen it happen in pipelines. I've seen it happen across the spectrum of energy. But I've also seen it happen, and I've seen it change all the way to hospitals, to power generation facilities, to wastewater facilities, manufacturing facilities. And what makes it even more challenging is what's happening in a macroeconomic capacity where pressures are being placed downward on overall budgets. In order to really understand how to deploy cybersecurity budgets in OT and IT environments, I thought it would be an excellent topic today to talk about why OT sites are fundamentally different. Asset owners are the ones that know the most about this. There's a ton of product companies, there's a ton of service companies, there's standard organizations. They'll tell you all the things you need to know about how to secure, how to protect, and maybe even how to do, your overall risk management better. But it takes a true asset owners that has been out there managing these assets for many, many years. And it's my pleasure to host a colleague from the Houston ecosystem in OT cybersecurity, Mr. Dennis Parker. Sir, thanks so much for joining, and thanks for taking the time to share your knowledge with the community.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Ted. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy and excited to be here.
Well, I am too, and I have to say that every time that we talk, there's an elegant, simple way that you translate really challenging concepts. And when we had lunch a couple weeks ago, one of the things that you and I talked about was how different 10 years ago and even today, IT personnel, IT trained security professionals, and OT personnel. They think different, right? They have different responsibilities. We started this conversation, and you said, well, that's because OT sites are different, Ted. And I said, what did I say? I said, that sounds like a topic that a lot of people would want to talk about.
Yes.
Where where did that where did that kind of come up with? What's the core belief system there, Dennis, before we dive in?
Well, I've been living in that world for the last decade, and so I would see it on a daily basis where uh, IT they have their own perspective, and they try or in their mindset they think of OT as just a specialized IT
Right,
operation,
right.
and there are similarities certainly in the technologies that are used, but there's a lot of differences which they don't account for, and that's really what I've dealt with a lot over the past decade is trying to educate my peers in IT on how these systems are different, why they're different, and how they need to approach OT when they have an idea of how they think they can help.
Right, right. Yeah, well, it takes somebody who has been in this world for a long time to have the depth of experience, right? Tell the audience a little bit about what's taken up the last 15 to 25 years and how maybe we can bridge that into our agenda today that we're talking about.
Okay, sure. Well, I'm retired now, earlier this year, but I did work at Chevron for a dozen years, and had a great time. Uh, and was a lot of opportunities there to solve. And really, you know, when I started out 8 years ago, well, really 10 years ago, kind of the journey started. Trying to integrate cybersecurity into OT, and that became a concern for the IT organization that there wasn't enough security at the time. It was a lot of firewalls and such were the only barrier, and between the two. And so, I had the opportunity to run a lot of projects for Chevron to try to improve the cybersecurity for their OT operations, but doing that in a way that was um, acceptable, I guess I'll say, to the OT organizations. They move a lot slower than IT, and
Right.
I'm sure we'll get into that in a minute. But I've worked in control systems for oil and gas for 40 years. And while I was in my position at Chevron, I uh, had opportunities to work with the ISA Security Compliance Institute, developing cybersecurity standards around OT. And that organization in particular was determining how to assure that devices were secure, right? That were built securely
Right.
for the OT market. I also was the chairman for Project Logic, which is a government private partnership uh, with CISA. And so we helped to define what did cybersecurity, OT, what did that convergence look like
Right.
for and to the government, because the government was really not familiar with this space uh, because they were very IT centric, of course, and so they really wanted to understand what are the challenges and how should the regulations adopt to those challenges.
Yeah.
So that was a major part of Project Logic, and I also contributed to IEC 62443 3-2, also known as zones and conduits, which you covered last week, actually.
Right. Yeah, it was a very well attended show. I think that
Hmm.
um, I think there's a lot of question marks up right now about, hey, how do I get started with OT security? What
Yeah,
standards do I implement? Does this standard apply? And I think that's a fair question. It's a fair question
yeah.
that I think a lot of CISOs, OT, IT security managers are wrestling with.
Hmm.
Would you agree that budgets you've seen over the course of multiple decades, you've seen budgets evolve, you've seen them change, you've seen OT and IT organizations, um, for lack of better words, maybe argue on the importance of things. And before we really get into the details of things, give us an understanding over the course of multiple decades how you've seen the resources for cybersecurity change as OT became a little bit more of an important aspect to the company's business outcomes.
Oh, goodness. Well, I guess it all starts 20 years ago. Before
Right.
20 years ago, uh, there was no cybersecurity for OT, none.
Right. Right.
These were isolated systems. They minimally connected to the business network.
Hmm.
And in the 90s, when they started connecting them, I mean, it was pretty much a firewall between the two.
Sure.
Uh, and that was it. If there was even a firewall, and there was a lot of cases back in the 90s where they didn't even have a firewall. They were just started connecting the IT and OT systems together so that they could share information. There's a lot of information that IT needs to process and needs to get from OT systems, having to
Sure.
do with billing, for oil and gas, which I'm in, how much product did we take in? How much did we, uh, you know, create, transform through refining and stuff? And
Right.
so that accounting was really the impetus of connecting the networks in the beginning 20 years ago.
Well,
Then 20 years ago, we started to kind of get a little bit concerned about it. But really, it was probably about 10 to 15 years ago that we really got serious and said, look, this could really impact our business
So we're
if we
talking
were compromised.
2007, 2008, somewhere around in
Hmm.
there, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And so that's where kind of the transformation started happening on the OT side, that
sure.
cybersecurity was something we needed to pay attention to. We couldn't, uh, there was still a lot of the mindset that these systems were isolated, even though they're not anymore.
Right.
And that, we're safe because we're behind a firewall, so we're protected. And we learned that that was very often not the case. There's a lot of holes through firewalls that get created over time. Some of them are, were very ad hoc back in the day. Not a lot of good change management in the beginning. And so we learned that maybe we're not so safe, right? And I think
Yeah.
just recently, the Colonial Pipeline incident really kind
Mhm.
of showed that, we're still vulnerable.
I think so, and it's more than just. I'm a big advocate on the non-technical side of the house. If we take a look at the agenda and what we're going to talk about, I'm a huge believer that if you don't understand kind of these are the points that you evolved. But if I may, what are the systems that we're talking about that are OT? How do we kind of segment that away from IT? What are we really talking about? A lot of the juniors in the audience might really benefit from understanding what do we mean by OT. But I think the biggest challenge that security and risk management players face is like, do we really think that we can run OT and IT security in a global company with the same people, the same skills, and the same mindset? And I would love for you to challenge that idea by saying, "Hey, look, here are the differences between OT and IT teams." And then finally, you see this is IT and OT convergence, divergence. Everybody under one budget, everybody under one roof. All the training across the board is equal. I'm really excited to dive into how is alignment possible? How can IT truly help OT and vice versa? Because if folks can walk away from the next 30 or 40 minutes understanding one thing they can do a little bit different in their teams or in their budgets or how they speak to folks, I think it's gonna I think it'll resonate well. So um, for those of you that are listening in, if you type a comment or a question, we can review it live, and we hope that we'll be able to answer it at that time. We've got 3 slides coming up. Anything that I've missed, Dennis, on these 3 talking points for you?
No, so far so good.
So as we kind of jump in, I just want to add one layer of context for the audience that I think should be spoken about. You talked about, hey, 20 something years ago, there just wasn't OT security. 15 years ago, a lot of people started scratching their heads. It has accelerated to the point now that the regulatory guidance that is coming down is really, in a lot of ways, it's good, but it also can become burdensome for a lot of security and risk management leaders. Um, but if you think about the who is talking about OT security, you have boards of directors, you have CFOs, you have people that have never really had experience or an education in the cybersecurity realm. But because OT security, because the effects of security on OT systems is starting to become such a mainstay topic, I think CISOs and security and risk leaders have a huge burden on their shoulders. So through that lens, why don't we dive into OT systems and some of your different talking points? I'm excited to dive in.
Okay, Ted. Yeah, thank you for that. And you did say one thing I want to respond to. If there's any board members out there today that don't aren't aware that cybersecurity is a concern, wow, they better
Better
catch
get
up
on board,
fast,
right? I
right?
think so. Yeah.
But I can tell you from Chevron's perspective. I mean, the board members have been very cognizant of the risk to the company of cybersecurity incidents, and have really been providing the impetus and funding to help close those gaps, because they are concerned. It's more and more in the news, and so uh, I don't I'd be really surprised to find a board member that doesn't know about cybersecurity, and pretty well about how their organization is handling it and what their approach is. So thank you for that. Okay, so yeah, what are OT systems? And for any folks on the call who are from the OT space, Probably now's a good time to go refresh your coffee because I am not going to say anything that's a surprise to you, I'm sure. Uh, so OT systems are systems that are designed to operate in the physical world. That could be refineries, pipelines, manufacturing, medical. It's a wide gambit of things, but they operate in the physical world, and that's uh, very different from IT. Uh, the primary function of IT is to process data. It's all about the storage and manipulation of data, and so right there, you're coming from a very different perspective that anything I do in OT systems can touch and affect and impact the physical world. Um, so they're expected, these facilities are designed to run for 20, 30 years. So you've got a lot of old stuff, and you've got some stuff that's been upgraded over time. So you have really a mixture of different equipment. And as I said, 20 years ago, we weren't really thinking about cybersecurity. Neither were the manufacturers of this equipment. And so, a lot of our older equipment is very insecure. And so we address that in many different ways. I just mentioned a few minutes ago the last uh, your last talk where you talked about with Kenny 625 62443, and
Right.
that's exactly what that was designed to address. But 20 years ago, equipment we have from 20 years ago, it's still insecure. And so that's where the idea of zones and conduits came into play, was we need to take that old stuff and isolate it off all by itself so that
Right.
there's an additional layer of protection between these old systems that are insecure by design, as Kenny would say, um, as opposed to the newer systems, which are very aware, right? And very much more uh, easily adapted to have security built in.
Now, just to
Uh,
break that in, if I may,
yeah,
so for folks that may want just a little bit more clarity, we're talking about valves, we're talking about engines, we're talking about robotics, we're talking about things that were designed to serve a certain function, whether that's move things faster, clean something cleaner, like simplify a process, automate a process. And the designers of those, say 20, 30 years ago, they didn't really have security in mind because the entire security landscape of how data is transferred and how things can be controlled without permissions has kind of evolved, right?
yeah, yes, it has.
Now,
And yeah, go ahead.
well, and the final thing is, can you talk a little bit about this? Is where I kind of tell people is like OT systems were designed to run a certain way. Let's call it an engineering drawing that says we're supposed to get this item from point A to point B a lot faster. We're going to implement a lot of OT systems to do that. They're designed to stay that way forever. Whereas we don't see that same level of standardization or fixed processes in the IT world. On the other hand, it's supposed to be configured however they need to configure it. Does that play a role in how OT systems kind of are defined? Is their actual structure and whether they're ever supposed to change or move?
Yeah, good point. Thanks for bringing that up. The OT systems are designed for the process that they are controlling. And everyone, every single one is different from one another. There are no OT systems that are identical, right? They are custom built to the application for which they are serving. I think last time we met, we touched on that a little bit, where
Right.
I talked about two platforms that were oil platforms that were built at the same time. Giant platforms took years to build, and they were supposed to be identical, and yet in the
Hmm.
end, they looked the same, but the guts were very, very different because two different contractors, built each one, and they made different little decisions along the way that
Right.
ended up making them very different from another. So you never find, uh, as you do in the IT space, two identical systems anywhere. They all are very much custom designed to whatever it is they are managing. whether that's a pipeline, whether that's a refinery. Different refineries uh, have different inputs. They take, different oil in or whatever, different inputs, products in, and they put different products out. Depending on the type of oil it is, um, you may get very different outputs because different types of oil have different amounts of different products in them to be refined. So,
No, I
uh,
think you bring up a good point, right? So you could have, and it's one of the problems that I think a lot of folks have, like the title of the show, OT sites are different. That can mean two things. OT sites are different than IT, right? And
yeah,
we've talked a lot about that. What you're talking about now is OT site A is very different than OT site B. And really, OT is a group of systems and processes inside of, let's say, a facility. So what
mhm,
for the audience out there, what we're talking about is you could have one company, let's call it an operator, that has two chemical facilities, it has two vessels, it has two of the same things. They have the same engineering drawings, but potentially because different contractors were used, different OEM providers were used, different engineerings were used. Maybe the purpose of that facility has a different purpose. The fundamental OT layout, the actual nuts and bolts of the equipment, the software running that, all of the different people in training, it could be totally different, which begs the question, can you kind of peanut butter a security and risk management program across all your facilities and have the same level of risk or the same level of security? And I think the answer is no. And that's actually where we talked originally about OT sites being different, is that they're different from each other.
yes. And now, can you design? Let me go back to what you just said. Can you
Mm,
design a security architecture that will fit all of those sites? You
right,
can. You can use the same products. You can create an infrastructure which is the same across the sites. But when
right.
you get to actual implementation at each site, you're going to have to adapt that product for those sites, right?
That's right. I mean,
And
we're
yeah,
we're talking about just like the language barriers or the OEM or the local security contractors at the facility level. So these global companies with global CISOs that have facilities in maybe 10 or 12 different countries, they have to meet different regulatory bodies. They have different
oh yeah,
capabilities. It becomes it really is a rabbit's hole when you start contemplating how do you deploy it. That's why I think the 62443 methodology, where you can go and say, okay, these are all my systems under consideration. These are my various zones and conduits. This is how I'm going to apply these threats from that region. So not to get too detailed there, but I do think that successful OT risk programs, as it applies to this slide, they recognize the OT systems are different. So it begs the question, and this will dive us to our next slide when you're ready, about the people side of the business. But how does an organization map a risk management program, maybe the differentiators there, based on the differences in their OT sites, just in general? I mean, do you have you seen different OT managers at the site level and they have full security control and they report to someone? Or is it better to have more of a centralized approach? How did things get challenging or different, considering these OT systems and all these different facilities are different?
it's a hybrid model, really. There are things you can centralize, and we'll get into that some of the details of that in a little bit. Um, but it's obviously customized, has been customized for each site. So um, the OT managers will have obviously some say and visibility in what gets
Mm,
changed when, and how it's actually been implemented for their site. But there can also be some commonality, and I think that's what we came to over the past couple of decades is,
right.
there are things that just have to be different because the systems themselves are different.
Right.
But there are similarities that can be leveraged to create some commonality also. So it's a little bit of both.
Makes perfect sense. Well, if you're ready, we can transition to the next slide about really teams in general. What's the
Well,
differences
actually, I'd like to
between?
talk a little bit more because there's a few more points I didn't get to cover yet.
Cool.
That you know these sites, and this is something's very different from OT, are expected to run 24/7 all year long. And when there are outages, when there has to be upgrades or whatever, for whatever reason, sometimes it's the actual process itself where, they have to do some maintenance and repairs. And so they bring the system down for a short while. Uh, so there's a lot of planning that goes into those events when the system is down. And that's a big difference from OT and IT is, IT, you usually have a change window. Might be once a week, might be every night, whatever it is. But these systems are always running. And so your opportunity to make changes, to do patching, for example, is very limited. These systems just cannot be brought down without a lot of planning. And so that's a huge difference between the two systems that I think IT has struggles to get a handle on. Is that, well, why can't you patch these systems this week or today? Right? This is an emergency critical patch. It needs to happen right away. Well, I'm sorry. The next scheduled maintenance window is 3 months from now, and that's
Right.
when we'll do it. And so you have to design those extra layers of protection in to account for the fact that these aren't going to stay as up to date and as current as your IT systems. They're just not. And that's, well, we'll get into profit versus cost in a little bit. But OT systems are everywhere, and in places that are surprising that you wouldn't even think of. And so this is a lot more prevalent of an issue across companies than a lot of people realize. My example of this is that, a few years ago, uh, Disney reached out to me through LinkedIn and said, "Hey, would you like to come work for us?" I'm like, "I'm a OT cybersecurity engineer. Why would I work for Disney?" Uh, and they've got OT systems in all of their theme parks.
Right.
and those and they were now concerned that maybe those needed to be secured, so that there was no potential for a cyber attack attacking their theme parks and
Right.
causing actual real world problems, the ride stopping or things like that, right? So it really kind of opened my eyes. Wow, OT really is a lot broader, coming from the oil and gas space, than I had imagined.
Yeah, I've seen
And
restaurants and
yeah,
transportation companies, things that you even retail organizations that have some element of automation that make their business differentiated a little bit. I think that the reason that OT has become such a large, and this is why it also is not extremely well defined by a lot of the core people who help define it. I think there's
hmm
this transition in the industry where everybody's just throwing their business into IT, IoT, or OT, and some of the original authors, um, I think that they have perspectives that OT and IT will never be converged. But I think the real challenge that we face as an ecosystem is that if the business is going to be impacted by some sort of outage, and we're not totally relying upon a computer, like an actual computer or a firewall, then you're probably asking yourself, what kind of critical systems do I have? So how do you draw the line between OT and IT as it relates to business outcomes?
so I mean, the line is very blurry, right? As you're pointing out, the business relies on data from OT in order to do billing and other important functions.
Right.
Obviously, cybersecurity is involved, and there's a lot of other uh, information that OT provides that is used by the business to make business decisions. And
Sure.
so there is that uh, connection between the two that you just can't separate. But really, where make that separation is where you get down to touching the physical world. Um, that's where you have to make this differentiation. And one thing that is very often talked about in the OT space and even amongst the IT folks is health, environment, and safety. OT can affect health. If there's a chemical release or something, that could be damaging to people's health. It can damage the environment. An unplanned release, can get out into the environment, and it does. And so that's another thing you want to prevent. And safety. You want to make sure that your workers are safe, that people visiting your sites are safe. And in the IT world, that's not something you have to worry about. Uh, I when I first started working very closely with IT. Matter of fact, when I got embedded into the IT organization, I was amused sometimes about how the IT organization took that HES concern and tried to apply it to their world. And so
It's not the same.
whereas on the OT side we were worrying about killing people, and on the IT side, well, we would joke, they worry about paper cuts. Is their HES concerns, right? Of maybe smashing a finger, or cutting yourself on a sharp edge on a piece of equipment
Right.
in the data center, would be their HES concern. And really, it's a lot more serious in the OT world.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that I read an article, I can't remember who came out with it, but there's kind of two camps. One is, hey, OT budgets are flattening out because there haven't been a ton of kinetic attacks. There haven't been some major world-changing event. There's a lot of people that think that Colonial Pipeline really wasn't an OT issue. OT systems were shut down in anticipation of just trying to get ahead of the problem. My personal perspective is irrelevant. What I did find interesting is the amount of data that exists on kinetic attacks or near misses of kinetic attacks with successful
Mhm.
OT security folks that you don't hear about in the news.
Oh yeah.
And that's a huge challenge because everybody wants to get on the health safety train, right?
Hmm.
But I think a select few people, whether it's practitioners or whether it's actual business managers, I think there have been tons of attacks. You just don't hear about them in the news. Your perspective, sir?
No, absolutely. That's not something you want to advertise as a company, that you were
No.
successfully attacked. And so it really only becomes public knowledge if there was an actual real world impact that the company can't ignore.
Well, you bring
In
up
Colonial's case, uh, you know, I know a little bit about that, and they shut down the pipeline not because it was under threat, but because they didn't know whether it was threatened or not. So as a
right,
safety thing, they shut it down to make sure that there couldn't be any real
right.
world impacts. But when they shut down the pipeline, it means nothing's flowing, and so the Northeast had significant shortages of gasoline and such, because the pipeline is a major conduit from the refineries along the Gulf Coast of products, refined products, up into the Northeast. And so they couldn't ignore that, right? They had to become public about that. But yeah, companies are not going to disclose when they've had, not to even, well, very rarely, I would say, to each other even, uh, when they have had cyber incidents.
Well, it's interesting because with the SEC's new guidance for publicly owned companies, they have to file within a certain period of time any sort of breach. And we had a couple folks on the show. It's like, what defines a breach? What defines an
Yeah,
attack? What there is a lot of gray area right now around this. I think that individual business leaders are still the ones that make the majority of the decisions. It's not
sure.
regulated well enough or detailed enough. Um, and I still think CISOs and security risk management leaders, they have a ton on their shoulders
Hmm.
because it's kind of like everybody wants an answer, but nobody can define really what they want to hear. Everybody
Yeah.
wants better security, but they don't really know what it takes to get better security. And it's like, I'm going to work with the resources you gave me. And
Hmm.
we're actually, we've I was talking to somebody about what it's going to cost people to meet the new pipeline directive updates.
All right.
What it's going to cost for the SEC, like actual dollars of how you would implement that regulatory compliance burden. Not saying it's not necessary, not saying it's good or bad, just what are the resources to deploy it? Um, and the numbers start ticking up, Dennis. It
Oh
is
yeah.
becoming a more expensive world to play in. That's and the
Well,
worst part about it is just there's not enough people to go around. And there's
well,
IT
that is
people.
the worst part of it.
So one of the things that you said earlier that I want to touch on, um, you mentioned, hey, when I became, because you're the OT security manager globally, right? When you became part of the IT program, not have to get into details of that, right? Every asset owner chooses to make their decisions differently. But one thing that I do find interesting is that there were some research analysts that said a couple of years ago that the vast majority of OT budgets, responsibilities, programs are going to fall onto the CIO. And so we're typically dealing with, I've always said, the IT program, the IT systems, the way that people are taking risks, managing them with some element of a resource allocation. It's been existent on the IT side for decades. So a lot of companies are just going to throw OT underneath it. But the biggest challenge they have is like, what are the difference between the OT and the IT teams, right? I see from my vantage point, there are actually more IT trained leaders that are responsible for OT security than OT security is reporting to somebody else. I've seen it all. I've seen business information security officers. I've seen CISO OT alongside a CISO IT. I've seen OT security managing up to operations. Um, if you're done with the previous slides and you're ready to transition to the teams, it's a huge challenge. This, what people are being asked to do from a regulatory perspective, but not have the people to go and rely on. How do you
Yeah.
challenge?
Oh,
How do you
no,
answer that?
absolutely. That's a huge challenge. You're absolutely right. And I will challenge one of your statements as well about the CIO being responsible for a
Right.
lot of the OT. Um, at the end of the day, the majority of OT is engineering. It's actually, like you said, valves and
Yeah.
uh, pumps and
Automation.
turbines and things like
Yeah.
that, right?
Mhm.
And IT, or OT, if you would, is
Right.
a very tiny part of that actual budget. So where I'm seeing the convergence is around security, right? The CIO is ultimately, at the end of the day, responsible to reporting to the board on cybersecurity. And so they need insights and input into the OT world so that they can effectively do that job. So where it comes to cyber, that's where you're really seeing the convergence. The control systems, the all of the systems that are in the OT world, they're just not general purpose data
So,
processing.
so you're saying the OT, I said OT falls under CIO, and you're challenging saying the OT security portion goes to the CIO, not the OT. Totally agree with you. Yes.
Okay,
The
yeah,
OT cybersecurity. And so that's a challenge though, right? So
yeah,
if the procurement, the design, the management, the maintenance is all managed by engineering or operations, yet this cybersecurity window for patching or for updates has to fall under somebody else. Does that make sense, Dennis?
yeah. I think it does.
You do.
I do. I do. I think it makes sense that, and where this is playing out, at least that I've seen, right, is that the CIO will have a budget for cybersecurity, for OT cybersecurity, that
Mm-hmm.
they'll provide to the engineering managers with instructions on what's to be done with that money, right? So
Right.
because the OT managers have historically been very resistant to spending very much money at all on cyber, and because it doesn't help them, get more profits, and we'll be getting into that in a minute. It doesn't help them uh, to to accomplish their mission, right? It's a distraction to them. And so that's where the CIO is coming in and saying, okay, well, what if we give you money to hire people to come in and help you with this, and figure out what your space needs and how to apply our regulations, our rules into your space. And that's where I've seen that evolve into, is basically it becomes a new source of money for the OT managers to spend to help them to better improve their cybersecurity for their space, and to get on board with some of the corporate standards.
Makes
Uh,
sense. Well, and it sounds like from your perspective, I don't think anybody would disagree with the way that you've outlined, at least one way that it could
Mhm.
work. You're saying that senior cybersecurity leaders, they know cybersecurity, so they're going to take a small amount of their budget, they're going to deploy it over to the operations or the engineering teams and say, "Hey, OT folks, we know how to secure this stuff, so we're going to give you some budget." But that right there is not as easy to achieve as one might think, Dennis. And I think a
Oh,
lot of
no.
people, and so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you would say that in order for that alignment to be successful, those leaders have to really understand OT environments and the differences on the OT teams, and they have to understand the differences between those OT and IT teams.
At a high level, they do, right? They're not going to understand the difference maybe between a refinery and a tank farm and a pipeline within their organizations, and they don't need to know that, right? What they need to know is that these systems have been secured to the corporate standards, and that they can report to the board and to the regulators that we're in compliance, right?
Very
And
cool.
that's the major concern, right? Is we need to be able to, with a straight face, be able to tell the regulators, the board of directors, that we're good.
May I
And
jump to the next slide to talk about those in more
absolutely,
detail?
absolutely,
Let's
I
do
think
it.
we've just segued right into the next slide.
So if I
So
could just simplify from my
yeah, please.
perspective what we talked about, and then I'm going to pass it right over. Um, if we're on the thesis that a senior cybersecurity leader is going to shift part of their budget to the OT teams and say, "Hey, here's our recommendation. Here are the resources we're going to give you." There's some fundamentals that may have to be achieved, and that is in the orange, keeping things running really effectively and safely. That's OT's mainstay. That's their priority. That's what they want. But the IT folks have always said, "Hey, let's patch at all costs." Right? I'll volley that over as two very very different belief systems on how do these teams work better together, Dennis.
Yeah. That's the challenge, right? That is the challenge, is how do you balance different priorities? And um, so but at the same time, cybersecurity is in, whether the IT organization uh, realizes it or not. They're into the uh, into the OT world is
Mhm.
through safety, right? Safety is paramount in the OT world. You don't want people injured or killed. You want to maintain, uh, you know, well, there's a common saying, you want everyone to go home safely at the end of the day, right?
Right.
And so if cyber threats can threaten that safety that's been built into the system, then OT managers are going to sit up and they're going to take notice, because that is their paramount. Well, I guess they have two paramount things, right? One is to make a profit. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the other is to do it safely. And so, where they see cybersecurity as a threat to that safety, they will sit up and take notice. And so that's IT's in. And I think that a lot of times they don't realize that
Right.
by showing how safety could be impacted, they can get at least some movement on the OT side in order to try to address that. But they have to be convinced, right? But you hear it all the time. But we've got a firewall, aren't we protected? Well, okay, that's one protective measure. But in OT, it's not about having one protective measure. It's about having layers of protection.
Well, I think you bring up a
Because
good point. Well, I'll
yeah,
let you finish.
well, because there can be many different things that can impact safety, right? And so in the OT space, they just don't have, they just don't put one safety mechanism out there and say, okay, we're done. They're going to put out layers of protection so that if one safety measure fails, there's a backup in place that's going to take over.
Right.
Uh, and then they're going to go look at that and say, why did the backup safety measure have to come into effect? What happened? Why did the primary fail? Right. And so they have these layers of protection uh, to protect, health, environment, and safety.
Well, it's
But
interesting because I think the biggest you made a point there, and I'm just going to kind of extrapolate on it.
yeah,
If IT owns a cyber budget and they want to shift it over to OT, or they want alignment there, the way that you get alignment from OT is by bringing up safety, right? I think
yeah,
that's what you're saying, and I agree. But I think safety, if you look at the foundation of it, safety is a business outcome. We want
mhm,
safe, reliable operations that are 100% against the maintenance cycle, or the operation cycle that we determine. So you never have to shut down for a safety incident. Well, I think it falls upon the cyber leaders, not the OT or engineering leaders, to draw the lines between this vulnerability, this threat, this likelihood tied to the outcome. Do you agree, or do you think that that's where OT is going to add more value by teaching the IT team? Because that fundamental moment of being able to connect a threat, vulnerability, risk, any of these jargon and terms that we use in cybersecurity, and connect it to a business outcome of unsafe operations, that is a granular event or activity that I think a lot of IT folks that haven't been on shop floors, that haven't been out on the rigs, that haven't really seen these systems, it's a big bridge to cross. And so, A, do you agree? And B, who do you think owns the responsibility of coming across that bridge more, Dennis?
right. So, yeah, that's a great question because that's exactly that very point is exactly why I was moved from engineering into IT,
Mm,
8 years ago.
right,
uh, was because they wanted someone on their side, effectively on the CISO, wanted
right,
someone from the engineering organization who could explain to them in terms they could understand why is this so difficult, right? And also be that conduit back into the OT side to say, look, you know,
this
let's
is what's
talk
going
about
on.
this because this really needs to happen. The question is when and how, right? And that's going to be different for each organization that you talk to. But you need someone who can coordinate from the IT side and but understands the space to say to recognize, it's not going to happen tomorrow.
Right.
When is it going to happen? What does your maintenance cycle look like? When are you going to be down next? When can we do these upgrades and put it on a schedule and report that back to the CISO? Uh, that so that they feel informed and know something's happening, even though it may not appear like it's happening, right? And so
Right.
you get this schedule of activities to say, okay, you know, this site here is going to do it on this date or within this time frame, and
I
this
just
site over here is going to do it there, right? And so you
staying on
see,
that.
yeah,
Please go ahead.
I mean, they're not perfectly happy about that because they're used to, just telling their IT organization patch all the systems and I want it done by this week, right? To it's got to be put on a schedule that I don't control.
Right.
And but just knowing that it's going to be done, that it's on somebody's schedule somewhere is a big help to them because now they can report out to the board, we're this percent done, this is the schedule, and that's really that visibility is very key to that CISO.
It's funny because so just to kind of recap, as an OT leader, you're
Mhm.
moved into the CISO's kind of organizational structure to drive alignment between OT and IT.
Yeah.
When I was one of the jobs that I had in Iraq as an Army officer was what is called an LNO, and the way that you just described it, um, exactly described my role there. I was a liaison notification officer. And my job was to come from this 740 person unit as an advance party to go talk to a very big organization of 3,000 that we were really a part of. But they didn't understand what we did. We didn't really understand what they did. So they had to trust one person who literally would be on the phone with two people at the same time, traveling from one place to the other, aligning efforts, talking about
Right.
what is important. And to me, I think that that's a really good kind of case study of what are one of the fundamentals of OT and IT alignment. Well, you have to have somebody that understands both spaces, is got a lot of patience, and is willing to move and transcend between these two organizational groups, either forever or for a period of time when both of them can work together more effectively. And it's got to be, I mean, how long did that take for you to get real alignment? I mean, ongoing, forever, or 2, 3 budget cycles? What do you think it takes for an organization that's globally
It took
positioned?
several years. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a big organization, global organization. So yeah, it took several years. But it helped a lot that I was coming from the engineering side. I was already basically doing very similar work, just from within the engineering organization. And now suddenly I'm in the IT organization doing pretty much the same work, just different boss, right?
right. Well, and I think that one of the things going back to the very, very beginning of our conversation today, OT sites are different. Like every single asset owner, it doesn't matter if they're in the same sector or the same subsector. It is so funny to me, and challenging for us all, how different two companies that the untrained eye would say have to run things the same, and they could not be more different in how they manage their OT and IT cyber security budgets. I think that's one of the challenges that we face is it isn't equal across everything, and it puts more pressure on the people actually deploying these cyber resources, which is why we're having this conversation.
Yeah,
So,
no, actually, Ted, to that point right there, there's a good reason for that, and I touched on that a little bit earlier, and that is that when a facility is designed, it's designed to last for
mm,
20 or 30 years, right? And
mhm,
so you may have two sites that are doing the same thing,
mm.
but they may have been designed 10 years apart. So one has much older technology than
That's
the
right.
other one, right? And so that is a significant problem that IT doesn't have to deal with, right? They go through their data center and every 3 years upgrade all the hardware,
No.
and just change it all out. It's all new, right? And in the OT space, that is does not happen. And so, particularly on the hardware side, the systems may get upgraded, but the hardware is still the same. And so you're facing a lot of the restrictions that a newer site that was built 10 years later may have, more capability to do things
Right.
that you need to
Right.
do. Whereas the older site, just it's the equipment's not even there.
Dennis, if I may, I have always said, and I think CISOs globally will say that IT has always been a cost center. I don't make I don't make tons of friends by saying this, but I've said it for a long time. I think we as an ecosystem have the capability to make OT part of the profit center. A lot of opponents to that thinking and a lot of head scratchers. But
Well, I think that's
for
absolutely. I
your
mean,
perspective,
that's my
yeah,
third
what do
bullet
you
point here, right?
dive in, man? Dive in because I'm
That
interested to
that
hear
that
your
yeah,
perspective.
that is the big thing that where IT and OT are always butting heads, because IT is a cost center, right?
Right,
IT doesn't make a company a dime of
right.
profit, uh, but OT is all about profit
Of course,
and making money for the company, and
those are the
so
business
that
outcomes.
that is a case where the two are butting heads because IT is a cost center, they are constantly being driven to renew the technologies, to make things more efficient, to
Mhm.
standardize,
Right.
uh, and to
Super, super,
reduce
super.
the overhead, the head count,
Mhm.
uh, and they do that through standardization, right? And by taking hundreds, actually at Chevron, it was thousands of different applications and trying to see how small can we make that bucket by standardizing those products. But in the OT world, it's all about profit. And this is one thing that it was really hard for me to get across to IT is that if let's say they really want to standardize around some type of optimization application or something, right? Why do we have 10 different optimization applications across the company? Why can't we just use one or maybe two? And when you get right down to it, well, optimization for even within, let's say, pipelines, optimization of a gas pipeline is very different from optimization of an oil pipeline,
Right.
uh, which is
OT
very
sites are
different
different.
than optimization for an electrical grid. And
While you were
so,
talking,
yeah,
well, no, while you were talking, I was thinking like, not to discredit the importance of the IT organization, but I'm a car guy, so I always put things in cars. It's like they're operating a rental fleet. How do we get this to look all the same? How do
yep,
we get them to be the most efficient? And how do we just get them working to a known standard? Whereas the OT group is building race cars. They want to go win races. They want to build that profit. They want to build that business outcome. The engineering, the way you think about it, every race car is different. Every single driver is different. Every course is different. That's the fundamental difference here is that,
You got it.
yeah,
You're going exactly where I was going, which is, IT is looking at the OT organization saying, why are there 10 different applications for this?
yeah,
And
right.
and the answer that's going to come back from OT, or well, let me put it differently. If an OT manager has the choice of going with the standard or using a special purpose application which is better suited for their need, right? And it's going to make the company, I'm going to spend $100,000 go put this application in place, and it's going to save us $2 million a year. On the
Why
OT
not?
side, I'm going to make that choice
You've got
every
to.
time. I'm not going to
Well, and I think,
question it, right? But the IT guys are saying, why do you have so many?
yeah, but they
Well,
should flip
because it
that.
makes us money, right?
Well, they should flip that. And I think there should be a service model. I think that the OT players, and this is getting a little bit into management and who's really the customer, right? But
Hmm.
if the CEO of the organization says, "Hey, my computer's not working really well," IT is going to jump really fast. Say, "Hey, the CEO says we got to upgrade software." OT should have that same level of importance. If OT says, "Look, this is what's going to make the company run better, safer, faster, more efficient. It's going to lead to more profits," shouldn't the IT group say, "How can I help you secure that? Let me help you secure that," rather than be the opponent to the OT system? I see that a lot. I see misalignment between OT and IT, and it's not against the leadership, it's not against the board. It's a natural process where it's like kids on at recess. I mean, who really is king of the hill and who really owns the responsibility of telling the other, "Hey, I need your support here." I think that's where leaders come in and have
Hmm.
to be dynamic. I think they have to be trained in both sides. I think they have to be supported by the leadership of their company, and they
Yep.
have to set a standard. And I see it happening across the globe, right? But everybody's happening at a different pace. So here's what I see. I see an OT person that's moving through his career that goes from one company that's relatively mature, kind of like the themes that you're talking about, Dennis. And then that individual goes somewhere else and people are still breaking open seashells with rocks. That that person has a decision to make. Am I going to help grow this company and teach them what I know, or am I going to be kind of siloed from everybody else? And I think the movement of people, the role that OEMs play, the role that consultants play, people that have more freedom of movement in this ecosystem,
Yep.
I think it falls upon them to take the good ideas, spread the good news, and do so eloquently. That's not what happens a lot of times, Dennis. A lot of people, they just get gridlocked because they believe this is how it's supposed to be. And it comes from IT and OT. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I think you're segueing right into the next slide here, Ted.
Oh, that's
That
good.
really, where do we find opportunities for IT and OT to collaborate?
Got it.
And how IT has to recognize that not everything can be standardized, but that doesn't
Right.
mean you don't look for opportunities to standardize. And it's not going to be an easy road. A lot of these software systems don't stand alone; they're ecosystems that have been built up over years. And so, trying to standardize is going to be uh, like surfing the big wave, right? That it's going to take a lot of skill and effort to negotiate that because at the end of the day, uh, you need to show the OT organizations how there's going to be a short term pain for standardization, but here's how
Hmm.
you're going to get a benefit long term, right? That there's a and they're very familiar with that trade off, right? They do it continuously on a day to day basis. They're looking at in a lot of chemical
Mhm.
processing and refining, right? They're looking at all the data and saying, what is the most optimal time for me to shut down the plant and say do a big cleaning, so that the process, because the efficiency is dropping, right? And so
Right.
at what point does that efficiency get low enough that it's actually worth it for me to shut it down, clean everything up, do some repairs, and bring it back up in a more optimal manner. So now I'm making more money per hour. And what's that cost of bringing it down, right? And they're always doing those types of calculations. So if IT can come to OT with those types of arguments, that's going to play to the OT audience to say, you're going to spend this money up front by standardizing, changing from what you have now to this new standardization. Uh, and in the long run, here's the money you're going to save, right? And so you're going to in you're going to get that trade off. And but at the same time, because all of these OT systems were built at different times with different systems, that standardization is not just a let's go toss in this new application and now you're up and running, because often that application that you're decommissioning was integrated with other applications, and you need to understand what's already in place at each facility, and building that cost model of how you're going to save and when the cost savings is going to be achieved uh, is going to be different for each site. And so it's complicated. They're not accustomed on the IT side to dealing with those kind of complications because all their
Right.
systems are already pretty much standardized. And so uh, and a lot of times it's just a you thou shalt, right? On the IT side, if a large organization like Chevron acquires a new company and brings them into the fold, there's going to be a period where they're going to figure out, okay, what do they have? What does this new company have? And
Right.
what systems do we have that are the equivalent? And how are we going to migrate all of their data, all of their processes into our system, right?
That's
And
not an
so
overnight process. That is
it's
not
not
an
an overnight
overnight
process.
process.
Right? So
And
you really have to look at exactly, Ted. You really have to look at um, each OT organization as a company acquisition. What would you do in a company acquisition with their IT systems? And that's how you have to look at these OT systems.
yeah, no, it's huge. Well, are there any other points? This whole theory of alignment, I know that's what we're talking about. We're talking about how do OT and IT really align? What are the trade offs? Is there
Yeah,
anything else that you want to tell our audience, Dennis, specifically about that
yeah,
before we close up
yeah.
here?
Because I realize we're at time here, so let me wrap it up
That's
really
okay. We
quickly.
can keep going. We can keep going.
Okay,
I just want to make
okay,
sure we give you that opportunity.
okay. Yeah. So, no, absolutely. The uh, where IT can bring a lot of benefit
Hmm.
is around this cybersecurity space, right?
Mm,
And so by bringing standardization of processes, of tools that you're using, et cetera, the one thing that is becoming more and more burdensome on the OT side, and quite honestly, most of them are not keeping up at all,
right.
is the pace of threats, of vulnerabilities is just increasing faster and
Right.
faster, right?
Right.
And that's not their main job, is to keep up with that. And yet they need to in order to keep it safe. That is definitely something that you can outsource to the IT organization on your behalf, right? So instead of each organization looking at all the different applications and then watching for any new vulnerability announcements or any new threats that are out there, if you can outsource, I mean that's something that's easily outsourced to the IT organization. But to do that, they really need an inventory of what do you have, right?
Sure.
So I think, um, and you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, the very first two elements in the framework are inventory.
Yep.
Have a software inventory, have a hardware
Have a
inventory,
hardware inventory.
right?
And it
And
doesn't say more than that, so it gives you a lot of leeway of how you
oh
go and
yeah,
deploy that,
absolutely, right?
but it is
And
tough.
so turning over that inventory of
Mhm.
your hardware and software products over into the IT organization, and having the central organization monitor that database for all the new threats and vulnerabilities and patches and everything else that are coming in. They can now feed that back to your organization and free up your engineers who are doing a very, quite honestly, poor job at it today, to say, here are the things that need to addressed. Here's their priority. Is this a critical vulnerability? Is this a moderate vulnerability? What is it?
Right.
And allow them to put it into their schedule so that they can get those systems on a schedule to be patched.
Right.
They know what what their uptime is. They know when they can bring those systems down safely, and let them, and then just have a report out, right? So that's now in a shared system where they can see what needs to be done. IT can sit there and monitor and see when are they going to do it? Did they do it? And then they can report to the board, who definitely wants to know all that stuff, of how well or where are the things that people are concerned about. And then that gives the ability for now IT to go speak to, maybe say, the managing director of a business unit who is um, behind. All the other business units have all patched for this vulnerability except for you. You need to make this a priority, and they can have those executive level discussions. You know, a lot of times, and this is what I've seen is ever since I got into this, cybersecurity space, a lot of times the disconnect is that the people, low level people in the IT organization, are going over into low level people on the OT side and saying, this is the problem. You need to fix this. But those people don't have the power to fix this. That those discussions really need to be happening at a higher level, where the executives are talking and saying, look, here's our list of things that we're really concerned about this month. And you need to make sure that your folks and their prioritization is set so that these things get done, right? And so, right, you're talking about two powerless entities who don't have any control over this stuff, trying to hammer out between them when this can get done, when really that needs to happen at a much higher level. And I think
IT
that's
OT alignment 101. I mean, you
it
you said
is,
it
it
best.
is.
I
But
mean, you're
really,
talking
that
about
alignment
tactical.
historically has happened at a low level, and it needs to happen at a much higher level when it
Yeah,
comes to you need to, right? That
right.
these you need to messages from IT need to happen at a higher level, so that
Sure.
it's going down the chain and not trying to flow very ineffectively up the chain.
That's very it's very good points, and I think it relies upon, again, your IT organization has to be very humble and a customer oriented capacity to say, hey, we're going to support OT. OT has to recognize that it's not the end all be all boss on cybersecurity, right? There
Right.
is a different skill set. And I think what you're saying is almost a triangle, right? So you have IT tactical, OT tactical. They both have to be communicating up to drive down really resource allocation, whether that's training that the OT
Hmm.
people need to be able to tell them kind of what needs to happen, and IT to tell the OT what needs to happen as well. Another problem that I see is the vendors, right? So I run into this all the time where OT will want to bring in a very specific OT oriented vendor. Maybe it's asset inventory, maybe it's network segmentation, maybe it's access control, maybe it's an incident response exercise. And IT says, hey, we got that covered. But do they really have it covered? Because different organizations, different sites need different things. They may need their own vendor, they may need their own technical capability, service capability. How do you manage that, Dennis, when you have leaders on both sides that are both right, feeding for the same dollars? Do you go back to finding that commonality like safety or uptime? How would you encourage organizations that are still siloed to kind of share those resources?
Yeah, I think from the OT perspective, safety is definitely going to get heard if you say
Right.
that there's a safety concern, but you have to be able to show that there's a safety concern. And that's where IT usually doesn't have enough visibility to actually draw that line, right? To say that this is a safety issue. So there
Mhm.
has to be that partnership between the two, to figure out what that line is. But part of the problem is, that for these systems, a lot of these systems that the business units are running, were built by the main automation contractor back when the system was first put together. And yeah, like you said, Honeywell or a Yokogawa or whatever, they're going to put in their own inventory assets. So they're going to have all that stuff to
Mhm.
go with it, right? Because
Right.
historically they had to have it in the beginning. The business unit, or their customers needed to have these things, and IT was not really 20 years ago when they designed the system, not at play, right? And so what you're looking at now, and there's a lot of processes built around those vendor systems. internally within the OT organization. So
Sure.
really, what you're looking at is having a parallel, let's say, inventory within the IT system
Yep.
that takes that data out, and this can be done. I mean, we did it under my watch, where we sucked all that data out of the systems and centralized it, and that became more or less the system of record that everyone was using, was that central database of inventory. And that allowed IT to then provide valuable services to the OT organization to let them know, hey, did you know that there's a vulnerability announced against this product that you have and you're using? And that became more of a partnership once that visibility was apparent on visible to both sides, once that was shared between them.
There's
And
no
that
doubt
was a
that
really, yeah.
a shared vision that translates into a shared program that translates
Hmm.
into shared systems of record or vendor usage is undoubtedly kind of the path that I think should be followed. I think what's happening right now are people jumping into the IT, OT security fray without the holistic solution, without the alignment, without the understanding of the strategy. It's like jumping into a cold river, So I don't know. I hope that those viewing have taken away at least one thing they can take to their organization. There's no doubt that you have a wealth of experience here coming from Dennis, talking about the overall ways that IT alignment can actually work. What are kind of some of the systems to bridge? And I think we owe it to ourselves as an ecosystem to keep talking about this. Um, Dennis, it's 11:12. We're at time, but I'm going to give you the final word prior to closing us out. We really appreciate you being here on the Business of Cyber show, and wanted to give you the final word for
Okay.
the audience there.
Well, thank you, Ted. I guess my final word on this is there is a path where IT and OT can collaborate to make things better for both sides, but there has to be partnership. There has to be, both sides have to come to the table and say and find those areas where they can align and where IT can add value to the OT side and really take a lot of the burden of cybersecurity in particular off of the OT folks and make their jobs easier and make it more apparent what they need to do in order to stay secure.
You heard it, ladies and gentlemen. OT IT Alignment 101 from Mr. Dennis Parker. Thank you so much for joining the show. Remember, resources, there aren't enough of them out there for your cybersecurity, which means you've got to make wise decisions. One of the
Yeah.
decisions people are going to be making pretty soon in the pipeline industry is how are they going to meet the new pipeline directive update? Network segmentation, incident response, and remote access control are the biggest cyber control families that are in the new directive. I'm going to challenge the industry on the other items, the people, the process, the alignment, the team, the budget. Where are they going to get that? How are they going to do assessments effectively? Join me on the 12th of September at 10 o'clock here at Central Time of the Business of Cyber Show. Thanks and have a great day.
Thank you, Ted. Thanks for having me.